Hello, I'm Anim-Addo and I work here in the Department of History at the University of Leeds. My research interests are on the Caribbean in the post-emancipation period, so I'm particularly interested in the Caribbean in the second half of the 19th century and the legacies of slavery. And today I'm going to be talking about the extent to which the effective operation of slavery in the British Caribbean colonies from the years circa 1760 to 1833 primarily relied upon the use of brutality. In 1778, the Reverend William Jones travelled to Jamaica and he wrote about his first encounter with slavery in the British Caribbean context. He wrote these words: "'Tis difficult for any who have never been to the West Indies to conceive the barbarous treatment of the poor slaves. When from a distance I have heard the loud smack of the whip from the naked body and the poor negro groaning and oft crying aloud, 'O God' and 'O Lord,' my blood has almost curdled in my veins." But how seriously can we take these highly emotive words about slavery in the British Caribbean? To what extent did this system primarily rely on the use of brutality? Well, today I want to make the argument that to a large extent this was a system that was characterised by everyday violence and by casual brutality. But at the same time, we do need to recognise that in the last decades of the 18th century and going into the early 19th century, particularly in the 1780s, the 1790s and 1800s, the pressure from abolitionists meant that increasingly planters became concerned about the treatment of the enslaved population, and the economic pressures that they were under meant that they became increasingly concerned with the health of the enslaved population too. Today we're going to focus on the island of Jamaica, and we're focusing on Jamaica for two reasons. The first reason is because in terms of the British Caribbean colonies, Jamaica was obviously the largest of the islands at approximately 140 miles long by approximately 40 miles wide. But we're also talking about Jamaica because of the economic significance of this island, because Jamaica through much of the 18th and early 19th century was producing large amounts of sugar and therefore large amounts of wealth for the British Empire. And as late as 1805, Jamaica was still the single largest exporter of sugar. So we're talking about an economically important island here. The slave regime was a brutal regime with slaves working in very physically arduous conditions, often malnourished and under the threat of punishment. As we know, with plantation labour, the enslaved population were organised into gangs according to their physical fitness and ability to work. So typically the first gang, or the Great Gang, would be comprised of people between the ages of 15 and 50 years old, women and men, who would carry out the most physically demanding tasks. So these enslaved individuals would carry out tasks such as creating holes for the sugarcane, planting, tying, carrying out loads and so on. In terms of thinking about the experience of plantation slavery in the Caribbean, we can look at the writing of Ottobah Cugoano. Cugoano was a man who corresponded with very well-known abolitionists such as Olaudah Equiano and Granville Sharp. And some scholars even believe that Equiano helped Cugoano to write his piece that appeared in 1787 entitled "Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil and Wicked Traffic of the Slavery and Commerce of the Human Species." And in this work, Cugoano wrote of his experience of slavery on the island of Grenada. He wrote, "Being in this dreadful captivity and horrible slavery, without any hope of deliverance, for about 8 or 9 months, beholding the most dreadful scenes of misery and cruelty, and seeing my miserable companions often cruelly lashed, and as it were cut to pieces for the most trifling faults. This made me often tremble and weep, but I escaped better than many of them. For eating a piece of sugarcane, some were cruelly lashed, or struck over the face to knock their teeth out. Some of the stouter ones, I suppose, often reproved, and grown hardened and stupid with many cruel beatings and lashings, or perhaps faint and pressed with hunger and hard labour, were often committing trespasses of this kind, and when detected, they met with exemplary punishment. Some told me they had their teeth pulled out to deter others, and to prevent them from eating any cane in future." As historian Elsa Govia has written of field slaves, these were people who lived and worked under the discipline of the whip. And in fact, we can think about the ways in which the legal system during the era of slavery underpinned and accepted this kind of extreme violence. So an early law in Barbados in the early 17th century stated that if a master's punishment resulted in the death of one of his slaves, the master simply had to pay a fine of £15. Or if a master's punishment resulted in the death of another slave, then the master had to pay a fine of £25. So we can see that it was only met with very lenient punishment if an enslaved person was killed. But conversely, those who insulted or who attacked Europeans on the island or descendants of Europeans faced very harsh punishments, which could range from whippings to mutilation, or in extreme cases, potentially even death. Part of the reason why the system of slavery was underpinned by this kind of everyday violence and casual brutality was because of the atmosphere of fear which sometimes bordered on paranoia amongst the slave owners. So we're talking about a situation in which, on the island of Jamaica, Europeans were outnumbered by a ratio of approximately 9-1. And so, of course, slave owners lived with this constant fear of slave uprising or slave revolt. On the island of Jamaica, their fears were realised in 1760 when Tacky's revolt erupted on the island in May. So this was a revolt which was plotted by Khans from the Gold Coast with a large amount of secrecy, which swept through the island in May 1760, and the rebels managed to recruit thousands to their cause. Eventually, the revolt was suppressed by combinations of militia troops, British troops, the British Navy, and the Maroons in Jamaica. And so eventually the revolt was quashed. Nevertheless, it was the fear of uprisings such as this which ensured that violence continued to underpin the slave system. One of the sources that Caribbean historians have used to think about the experience of slavery in Jamaica is the diaries of a man called Thomas Thistlewood. Thistlewood arrived in Jamaica at the age of 29 in 1750, and he remained in Jamaica until his death. Historians such as Douglas Hall and Trevor Bernard have examined Thistlewood's diaries to think about the experience of the enslaved population and to also think about the experience of slave owners. Now, of course, in this case, we're talking about the diaries of just one man. So to what extent can we really extrapolate about the situation on the whole of the island of Jamaica? Well, on the one hand, we have to recognise that it was quite unusual for slave owners to keep diaries. And this is something that the historian Trevor Bernard has pointed out. This is something that sets Thistlewood somewhat apart amongst his peers. And this might suggest to us that this was a man who was quite a thoughtful and a reflective man. But on the other hand, as Bernard has also pointed out, this was a man who was very much accepted by the society that he was in. So his behaviour could not have been so much at odds with those around him if we think about the fact that he was a part of society and he was accepted in the society. So this has been seen as a useful source for historians. Slave owners in Jamaica, as elsewhere, were expected to treat their slaves with a firm hand. Thistlewood's diaries indicate that his slaves were punished with whippings which could run to as many as 350 lashes. The enslaved would have salt, lemon juice, or urine rubbed into their wounds. And Thistlewood would also have the enslaved placed in stocks overnight. For those who attempted to run away, there was a case, for example, in Thistlewood's diaries when a slave named Plato was sent out to look for other runaways, but Plato himself disappeared for 3 months. And as a result of this, Plato was sentenced in 1765 to 100 lashes and also had his right ear cut off. So those who attempted to run away could face mutilation or, in extreme circumstances, could face death. At the same time, Thistlewood's diaries indicate that slave owners lived very closely alongside the enslaved population, and there are occasions on which Thistlewood indicates concern for his slaves. As the 18th century wore on, and in the 1780s and 1790s, abolitionists' voices became increasingly louder. At the same time, it became more and more clear that the British government was committed to regulating the slave trade. And in this context, it became more important for planters to consider the health and the well-being of the enslaved population. In this context, the economic value of enslaved women, in particular, became more widely recognized. The treatment of enslaved women presents us with an interesting case because, as Diana Payton has pointed out, the flogging of women was something that abolitionists were very keen to raise awareness on, and this was something which abolitionists pointed out was a cruel practice and also an indecent practice. And the reason why abolitionists thought that this was indecent was because most often the enslaved women would be partially or entirely naked when they were flogged. So this was something that abolitionists were concerned to really protest and petition against. And this presents us with an interesting case because planters in the British Caribbean insisted that they could not abolish the practice of flogging enslaved women because they said that the plantation system would not work without the use of the whip. So this shows us the extent to which violence underpinned the whole plantation slavery regime. Even under pressure from London, the Jamaican Assembly refused to abolish the flogging of enslaved women or even women who were pregnant. Nevertheless, in the late 18th century, we are talking about a period in which planters did become increasingly concerned with the health of the enslaved population and the ability of the enslaved population to reproduce itself. Historians Betty Wood and T.R. Clayton have looked at a man called Simon Taylor who owned a plantation called Golden Grove Plantation in Jamaica. And they have examined Simon Taylor's records to suggest that amelioration and practices under the period of amelioration did in fact increase the health of the enslaved population. When we think about Simon Taylor, he was a man who defended the system of slavery, and in the face of the kinds of arguments that abolitionists advanced, Taylor insisted, and he made here an argument that was pretty common amongst slave owners, he insisted that the enslaved population in the British Caribbean were much better off than poor people in England. But nevertheless, Taylor recognized that there was a problem with the health of his slaves, and he sought to innovate in the 1780s to try and improve their health and improve the ability of the slave population to reproduce. So one of the things that Taylor decided to do was he decided in 1789 that he would have a lying-in house. And he made this decision because infant mortality and the problem of neonatal tetanus, so tetanus amongst very, very young babies, was prevalent amongst the slave population and on his plantation. And Taylor decided that by having a lying-in house where he could bring enslaved women who were pregnant and have them give birth, this might actually promote the ability of young babies to live. Now, the enslaved women did not necessarily welcome this innovation because, of course, they had their own practices and they had their own customs around childbirth. But nevertheless, this shows us that at the scale of the plantation, this was a period when changes were taking place, which worked to an extent to mitigate some of the brutality of slavery. At the same time, Taylor became increasingly concerned with the health of the adult population. So he decided that by having a hospital, this would ensure that his slaves who were suffering from poxes, from sores, from aches, could get back out to work much more quickly. So here we have two examples of innovations at the scale of the plantation, which show the ways in which amelioration policies did actually change practices in plantations and help to mitigate some of the brutality of the system of slavery. To summarize, the system of slavery was a brutal system. It was characterized by everyday violence and casual brutality. The enslaved were expected to work under physically demanding conditions, sometimes malnourished, and under the constant threat of the whip. And we can think about the whip as an instrument and a threat of everyday brutality, which was part and parcel of the system, which was worked into the fabric of the system. For those who tried to run away, they faced the threat of mutilation and potentially also death. And the most brutal punishments were meted out to those who were involved in rebellions or uprisings, such as tackies. We've seen through the diaries of Thomas Thistlewood the ways in which brutal punishments and everyday violence formed part and parcel of plantation life. But at the same time, we have considered through the writing of Simon Taylor the fact that amelioration did cause changes at the plantation level. And so on his plantation, he tried to innovate around medical practices and promote the health of the enslaved population. The 1780s, 1790s, and 1800s were then a period in which changes worked somewhat to mitigate the brutality of the slave system. We've talked today about Jamaica, but we need to remember that when we're thinking about the brutality of the slave system, while there were many commonalities between locations, the extent to which the enslaved population suffered brutality would have varied from plantation to plantation, it would have varied from island to island, and it would certainly have varied from one British colony to another.